Carl Gustav Jung was a Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, born in 1875 and active throughout the first half of the 20th century. He is best known as the founder of analytical psychology, a school of thought that emerged as a distinct alternative to Freudian psychoanalysis. Jung's work focused on the structure and dynamics of the psyche. He introduced key psychological concepts such as the collective unconscious, archetypes, individuation, and the persona, among others. Unlike Freud, who emphasized repressed desires and personal unconscious material, Jung proposed that there exists a deeper layer of the unconscious mind shared across all human beings, the collective unconscious. This realm contains universal symbols and patterns of experience, called archetypes, which appear in dreams, myths, religions, and art across cultures. Analytical psychology also centers on the process of individuation, the integration of the conscious and unconscious aspects of the self. For Jung, this was not only a therapeutic process, but a lifelong psychological and spiritual journey toward wholeness. Jung's interests extended beyond psychology into religion, mythology, alchemy, Eastern philosophies, and Gnosticism. He viewed these as symbolic systems that reflected deep psychological truths, and he believed that understanding them could offer insight into the nature of the self. He was a thinker who stood outside all conventional frameworks. Unbound by the scientific materialism that dominates our era, he sought out ancient truths, which the broader scientific community often dismisses as mere superstition. Jung was able to bridge multiple sciences, both academic and esoteric, mystical and empirical, thus creating an extraordinarily comprehensive system that, in our view, made him the last of the great initiates. Jung was a modern mystic who managed to articulate with scientific clarity ancient and complex mystical concepts, most notably the idea of archetypes. Let us examine his core ideas and show why he was a true initiated master. In the lineage of Hermes, Orpheus, Plato, and Blavatsky, the ego. Jung described the ego as the center of conscious experience, essentially the I, or sense of personal identity. Ego comprises our waking thoughts, memories, and emotions, giving us continuity and self-awareness each day. It stands at the junction between inner and outer worlds. It perceives, evaluates, and organizes our experience, much like an organizer of consciousness. However, the ego by itself represents only a small portion of the full psyche. Much of the mind lies outside awareness, in the unconscious. In the Gnostic system, the ego is not simply the conscious self. It is the false identity constructed through ignorance, fear, and attachment to the material world. This ego is viewed as a byproduct of the archons, the false rulers of the toe, lower realms, and especially of Yaldabaoth, the blind demiurge who created the physical universe in error. The ego is the prison of the soul. It is a layered construct. Pride, envy, lust, greed, fear, and the illusion of separateness. These are not just moral failings, but psychic veils that block the inner spark of divine knowledge, the gnosis. Jung knew this, and his solution to this problem will clear later in this video. The goal of the Gnostic path is not to strengthen or refine the ego, but to dismantle it. To disintegrate the ego means to dissolve these psychic constructs that bind the soul to the false world, what the Gnostics called the kenema, the emptiness or deficiency. As the ego dissolves, the divine spark or pneuma begins to awaken. This is not the creation of a new identity, but the return to what has always been present, the light of Sophia, the seed of the pleroma within. In this sense, ego death is not annihilation. It is remembrance. The soul begins to recognize its origin beyond the demiurge's domain, and seeks union with the divine fullness from which it fell, the persona. Persona is literally the mask one wears in society. The persona is the public face or role we present to others for social adaptation and convenience. A well-functioning persona helps us succeed socially by showing acceptable traits and behaviors in different contexts. Jung warned that identifying with the persona can be dangerous. If the ego equates itself with the social mask, one can lose touch with genuine feelings and other parts of the self. In fact, the traits excluded by the persona tend to be pushed into the shadow. The shadow, repressed and compensatory self. The shadow is the unconscious aspect of the psyche that contains the parts of ourselves we refuse or fail to acknowledge. Jung described the shadow as carrying all the qualities we do not want to know about ourselves or do not like, often the opposite of our conscious persona. For instance, a kind outward persona may coexist with an angry, envious shadow side. Importantly, the shadow is not simply bad. It also holds positive potentials, creativity, instincts that have been repressed. Jung emphasized that where there is light, there must also be shadow if one focuses only on the persona. Light, the psyche becomes one-sided, losing depth. Confronting the shadow is thus essential for balance. Is necessary bringing the shadow material into consciousness, admitting our anger, envy, fear, and other dark feelings rather than denying them. We integrate the psyche and become more whole. Neither the ego or the shadow is our true self. The integration is hard, but Jung viewed it as crucial for psychological health and self-awareness. In summary, the shadow acts as a counterbalance to the persona and ego. It harbors disowned traits and both destructive and creative energies, which must be reconciled for the personality to mature. Anima and animus, inner opposites along similar lines. Jung posited anima and animus as the contrasexual archetypes within the psyche. The anima is the unconscious feminine side in a man, and the animus is the unconscious masculine side in a woman. These inner figures arise partly from collective images of gender and partly from personal experience. In effect, the anima or animus compensate for a one-sided conscious identification with one's own sex. For instance, a man's psyche naturally contains feminine instincts which may be repressed by a rigid masculine persona. The anima then represents this repressed femininity, seeking expression. Often the anima or animus first appears in projection, especially in romantic attraction. Jung famously described love at first sight as a man projecting his anima onto a woman, or vice versa. In other words, one can be intensely drawn to someone who seems to embody one's inner image of the ideal feminine or masculine. Over time, however, the unconscious figure demands integration. Jung taught that mature development requires acknowledging and relating to one's anima or animus, absorbing those complementary qualities rather than remaining governed by an unconscious projection. He noted that traits labeled masculine and feminine are simply two halves of a whole. Neither is superior. The idea of anima and animus is a very clear allusion to the principle of gender described by Hermes Trismegistus in the Emerald Tablet. It also echoes the myth presented in the Symposium by Plato, which tells that humans were originally created in hermaphroditic bodies, both male and female at once, but were later split in two, becoming incomplete. Because of this separation, they seek their other half of the opposite gender in order to feel whole again. Archetypes are innate, universal patterns or primes of human experience embedded in the psyche. They are not personal memories or learned ideas, but inherited modes of functioning templates that shape how we perceive, feel, and act. An archetype manifests whenever its energy is activated, giving rise to recognizable figures such as the mother, hero, shadow, wise old man, or trickster. In dreams, myths, fairy tales, and art across cultures, we see these same figures play out in diverse settings, yet always carrying the same core dynamics. Archetypes operate beneath conscious thought. They organize experience by providing symbolic, reference points, guiding emotional responses, and offering a shared language for inner processes. Recognizing an archetype in one's inner life, say, the sudden emergence of a protective mother image allows the individual to consciously engage with that dynamic, transforming it from an unconscious compulsion into a source of insight and growth. The collective unconscious is the deeper layer of the unconscious mind that Carl Jung proposed is common to all humanity. Unlike the personal unconscious, which stores forgotten or repressed material unique to an individual, the collective unconscious contains the archetypal foundations inherited through evolution and shared by every human being. It is a psychic reservoir of ancestral experiences and predispositions, not dependent on personal history or learning. Jung arrived at this concept by observing the recurrence of the same symbols and motifs in dreams, myths, and rituals from widely separated cultures. The collective unconscious functions as a transpersonal matrix, supplying the archetypes through which individuals unconsciously structure perception and behavior. Although inaccessible to direct awareness, its influence surfaces in synchronistic events, spontaneous visions, and universal symbols that seem to originate from a source beyond the individual. Engaging with the collective unconscious through dream work, active imagination, or symbol analysis reveals these deep layers of the psyche, offering a pathway toward greater self-knowledge and integration. Many of the doubts and apparent contradictions found in the study of religion and spirituality. One of the main arguments of an enthusiastic atheist, intoxicated by his shallow materialism, is to say, how do you know your God is the true one? Why can't the other 100,000 gods be real, and you be the one who's wrong? When you understand the concept of archetypes, you realize that all religions are partially true, because the gods of mythologies are nothing more than forces and energies associated with a particular archetype. It makes no difference whether you worship Ishtar, Inanna, Astarte, or Isis. These are different goddesses representing the same thing, the same force. The same applies to the Islamic Allah and the nameless God of Orthodox Christianity. In essence, they are the same demiurge who imprisoned us in the flesh and demands exclusive worship. Any form of exclusive worship, or any religion claiming to be the only truth, is lying at least in that regard that an occultist, magician, or initiate understands that one must work with the pantheons according to one's intentions and affinities. Referring to the religiosity of the channel's author, we could say that Theli, Tamat, and Jarmungandr are also expressions of the same archetypal force, the primordial chaos. The collective unconscious is, in itself, the astral world, and all thoughts, individual and collective, accumulated throughout human history, take form there. Therefore, an archetype is an egregore generated over time through generations, thoughts, rituals, and beliefs, becoming something real and more, or less powerful, depending on the intensity of belief and the energy invested in that idea. The self in Jungian psychology is the central archetype and organizing principle of the entire psyche, encompassing both conscious and unconscious dimensions. It is not merely another part of the mind, but the living totality toward which all psychological processes are directed. Where the ego is the I that navigates daily life, the self is the deepest core of one's being, the inner source of meaning, purpose, and unity. Conceptually, the self functions like a psychic nucleus. It holds opposing forces, light and shadow, anima and animus, thinking and feeling in dynamic tension, ensuring the psyche's homeostatic balance. Though largely unconscious, the self makes itself known through symbols, mandalas, synchronicities, and transformative experiences that seem to originate from beyond ordinary thought. As an archetype, the self embodies both divine wholeness and human potential. It represents the ideal of psychological integration, where every fragment of personality, no matter how neglected or dark, finds its rightful place in a larger, harmonious pattern. Encountering the self often feels like meeting one's true essence, an encounter that can be both awe-inspiring and disorienting, because it transcends the usual boundaries of self-identity. Psychologically, aligning with the self involves listening to inner promptings, dream images, intuitions, creative impulses, and trusting them as expressions of a wiser center. It requires the ego to yield its absolutism, accepting that it is one part among many, and allowing the self's broader perspective to inform choices and values. In this way, the self serves as both the destination and the compass of the individuation. The self is the dynamic core that animates growth, healing, and authentic living. Far from an abstract concept, it is experienced as a felt sense of connection to oneself, to others, and to something greater than personal history. In the words of Jung, the self is the archetype of order and the inexhaustible source from which true personality unfolds. The self is not something created by life experience. It is inborn and archetypal, present from birth. Like the higher self in Gnostic, Hermetic, or Eastern teachings, it represents something eternal and unchanging, veiled by illusion, social roles, and the limitations of the ego. Unlike the ego, which represents ordinary consciousness and the socially constructed identity shaped by experience and environment, the self is the center and totality of the psyche. It encompasses the ego, the personal unconscious, and the collective unconscious. More profoundly, it acts as an inner guiding principle, leading the individual toward integration, self-knowledge, and in spiritual terms, the remembrance of their true nature. The self is our true soul, our superior self, the Atman from the Hindu. Self is the spark of divine light imprisoned in flesh by Yaldabaoth. When he seeked for our true nature, our pure and higher soul, we clean the filth staining our spiritual vessel. We break the shell locking our divine nature. The search for self, for completeness, is the gradual process of destroying the illusions imposed by this flawed universe. The self is not something created by life experience. It is inborn and archetypal, present from birth. Like the higher self in Gnostic, Hermetic, or Eastern teachings, it represents something eternal and unchanging, veiled by illusion, social roles, and the limitations of the ego. Unifying center of the psyche, rather than being just another part of the mind, the self is the psychic nucleus, harmonizing all opposites within the personality. This mirrors the function of the higher self in esoteric systems, to unite the inner being and reconnect it to the divine, bridging matter and spirit, source of purpose and meaning, the process of individuation, where the ego realigns itself with the self, is akin to the initiatory spiritual journey. The self doesn't just guide the psyche, but also reveals inner purpose, the sense of calling or destiny. Like the higher self, it leads the individual beyond illusion toward truth, authenticity, and spiritual fulfillment. Symbol of the complete soul. The self appears in universal symbols of wholeness, mandalas, divine figures, radiant light, inner teachers. In spiritual terms, it is the point of contact between the human and the sacred, the divine soul. Within, forgotten or hidden by the ego, but always present and waiting to be reawakened. Individuation. At last, to Jung. The process of individuation is the central transformative process in Jungian psychology by which an individual comes to realize and embody their unique, integrated self. Rather than a series of discrete steps, it is best understood as an ongoing, dynamic tension between conscious awareness, the ego, and the multiple layers of the unconscious. This process unfolds as the ego gradually loosens its grip on narrow self-images, the roles, beliefs, and identifications that have defined us, while simultaneously opening to the deeper currents of instinct, emotion, and spirit that lie. Below the surface dot at its core, individuation is the movement from fragmentation toward wholeness. It involves a continual dialogue between what we think we are and what we truly are. The small, conditioned ego versus the vast, archetypal self. The self represents the totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious, and carries the organizing principle of balance and purpose. As the ego becomes more receptive to signals from the unconscious, dreams, symbols, intuitions, it learns to make space for the rich complexity of inner life, repressed impulses, creative drives, spiritual longings, and ancestral wisdom. Through this process, the individual develops a fluid identity, one that can shift and expand rather than cling to fixed narratives. The ego does not dissolve or disappear. Instead, it repositions itself as a servant and expression of a deeper center. In practical terms, this means cultivating an attitude of inner listening, noticing when familiar patterns repeat, recognizing sudden insights as invitations rather than random thoughts, and treating inner conflicts as gateways rather than obstacles. Over time, the person experiences a growing sense of inner cohesion and authenticity, empowered by both reason and mystery. Ultimately, individuation is a return to self, a rediscovery of the latent wholeness we all carry. It is the psychic equivalent of deconstructing the false self imposed by culture, family, and circumstance, and allowing the living core of our being, our true essence, to shine through. In this sense, it parallels spiritual paths that speak of awakening or illumination, yet remains grounded in the language of psychological integration rather than dogma. Individuation, then, is the lifelong journey of becoming who we truly are. In spiritual terms, individuation and theosophical tradition Carl Jung's concept of individuation is the lifelong process of self-realization in which the ego integrates unconscious contents and opposites, conscious, unconscious, personal, collective, divine, human, into a unified whole. Jung described individuation as the process of self-realization, the discovery and experience of meaning and purpose in life, the means by which one finds oneself and becomes who one really is, achieved by synthesizing opposing elements of the psyche. He saw the self, the totality of psyche, as both the inner center and outer circumference of personality, embodying a divine seed at the heart of the individual. In effect, individuation seeks to strip away the false wrappings of the persona and inflated ego, exposing an inner core or God image that transcends the limited self. As Jung put it, the ultimate aim of individuation is to release the self of the false wrappings of the persona on the one hand, and the suggestive power of primordial images on the other. It's a transcendental process worthy of the efforts of the most learned Indian sages in the arts of esotericism and transcendental meditation. Gnostic cosmology, Demiurge Sophia, and the divine spark, the demiurge, ignorant of the higher realms, fabricates a flawed physical universe. Crucially, however, Sophia's anguish implants a spark of divine consciousness into the creation. As Gnostic texts say, Sophia infuses some spiritual spark, or pneuma, into matter. In this way, every human soul carries the divine spark that longs to return to the pleroma. Gnosticism teaches that salvation is not external, but an inner awakening. Knowledge of one's true origin in the divine pleroma rekindles our divine nature. The Gnostic path is directed toward inner illumination or experience of the divine spark within, a recognition that redeems the Sioux. This mirrors Jung's emphasis on self-knowledge as spiritual. Jung himself noted that Gnosticism argued for the transcendence of the physical world and the divinity of self-knowledge, a thesis Jung advanced through individuation. In other words, Gnostics and Jung both hold that discovering the inner Godhead is the key to liberation. The process of individuation is a modern interpretation of the search for the illumination, for gnosis, for spiritual deliverance, the destruction of ego as the Hindu would seek. When we become the true self, all the illusions vanish, and we get closer to the pleroma, to transcend the material world and all the cosmic dirt contaminating our divine essence. As we can see, Carl Jung was not merely a psychologist. He was, in essence, an initiate, a modern heir to the ancient lineage of spiritual seekers who pursued inner knowledge over dogma, gnosis over belief. Jung recognized that the greatest mysteries are not out there in the heavens, but hidden within the human soul. In his exploration of the unconscious, archetypes, the self, and individuation, Jung resurrected the timeless wisdom of the mystery. Schools clothed in the language of psychology. He spoke of the self not as a clinical abstraction, but as the divine center of being, the Atman, the divine spark of Sophia in man. He taught that true healing and wholeness come not from conformity or repression, but from the courageous descent into the depths of one's own psyche journey. Mirrored in every esoteric path, Jung did what few dared in the modern age. He bridged science and spirit, reason and mysticism. While the materialist world was turning away from the sacred, Jung was preserving it, translating it, disguising it, and embedding it within the very structure of psychological development. Individuation, in its fullest sense, is nothing less than the inner path of initiation, the alchemical process of ego death, spiritual rebirth, and union with the higher self.